The Spartacus slave revolt in the Roman Republic began not as a grand strategy, but as the desperate escape of a few dozen gladiators from a training school in Capua. Spartacus, a Thracian, who had once served in the Roman army before being enslaved, became the unexpected leader of this breakaway group. What started as a local incident quickly erupted into a widespread crisis that would terrify Rome's elite. The escaped fighters first armed themselves with kitchen tools and gladiatorial weapons, defeating the small force sent to recapture them. As word spread, thousands of enslaved people, men, women, and even children, fled their owners and joined what soon became a rebel army. Spartacus didn't simply want revenge. He aimed to lead his followers out of Italy and back to their homelands, away from the endless cruelty of Roman servitude. Yet the rebellion kept growing, drawing in those with no home to return to, but everything to fight for. Roman authorities at first underestimated the rebels, sending poorly organized militias that were swiftly defeated. As the rebel force swelled to nearly 70,000, Rome was forced to recognize the scale of the uprising. Spartacus proved a brilliant commander, defeating multiple legions and maneuvering with agility across the countryside. His army repeatedly outwitted better-equipped Roman forces, and for nearly 2 years, it seemed as though they might escape entirely. However, internal disagreements and the lure of plunder fractured the rebels' cohesion. Some wanted to march on Rome itself, while others, like Spartacus, still hoped to leave Italy. Rome eventually appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus to crush the rebellion, granting him wide powers. He pursued Spartacus with relentless discipline, punishing his own troops to instill fear and order. The final confrontation came in southern Italy, where the rebel army, cornered and weary, made a last stand. Spartacus is believed to have fallen in the fighting, though his body was never identified. In the aftermath, thousands of survivors were captured and punished publicly along the Appian Way, a chilling message to anyone considering defiance. Yet even in defeat, the revolt left a lasting scar on Roman memory, a reminder that even the world's greatest empire was not immune to uprisings from within.
The Jewish Revolt against Rome, also known as the Great Revolt, erupted in 66 CE in the province of Judea, born from years of rising tension, religious friction, and heavy taxation. Rome's rule had long been seen as oppressive by much of the Jewish population, but the final spark came when Roman officials looted the Second Temple's treasury, triggering widespread outrage. Fueled by anger and a powerful sense of identity, rebel factions rose across the region, initially overwhelming the Roman garrisons. Cities fell, and the rebels took control of Jerusalem, declaring open defiance against one of the most powerful empires in history. Early victories gave hope to those who dreamed of independence, but Rome's response was swift and unforgiving. The emperor dispatched General Vespasian and his son Titus with tens of thousands of soldiers to crush the rebellion. What followed was not a series of battles, but a grinding campaign of siege, starvation, and attrition. As the Romans advanced, they recaptured city after city, leaving ruin in their path. Inside Jerusalem, the situation grew dire. Various Jewish factions, instead of uniting, turned against each other, weakening their ability to resist the inevitable siege that loomed. By 70 CE, the Roman army encircled Jerusalem. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, and desperation set in. The Romans methodically breached the city's defenses and launched a final assault on the Temple Mount. The Second Temple, central to Jewish religious life, was set ablaze and destroyed. Flames and rubble replaced centuries of sacred tradition. The sight of the burning temple would echo through Jewish history for generations. Titus paraded through Rome with the spoils, and the event was immortalized in the Arch of Titus, which still stands today. The revolt formally ended by 73 CE with the fall of Masada, a desert fortress where the last holdouts made a final act of resistance rather than surrender. The cost was staggering. Entire towns were wiped out. countless lives lost, and Judea was left in ruin. In the aftermath, Jews were banned from Jerusalem, and the region was renamed to erase its identity. Yet despite the crushing end, the revolt became a symbol of unyielding spirit. It served as both a cautionary tale and a legacy of resilience, echoing through the centuries in prayers, memory, and culture.
The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 swept through England like a storm, ignited by frustration that had smoldered for years beneath the surface of medieval society. Following the devastation of the Black Death, a reduced population gave laborers more bargaining power, but the ruling elite responded by trying to freeze wages and enforce old feudal rules. When a new poll tax was introduced to fund ongoing wars, the burden fell hardest on the poor. That final insult triggered a rebellion, one that would see thousands of farmers, artisans, and townsfolk rise up in open defiance. At the heart of this explosive movement was Wat Tyler, a charismatic and practical leader who quickly gained a following. The rebels moved swiftly toward London, gaining momentum as they marched from the countryside. Along the way, they destroyed tax records, attacked manorial estates, and freed prisoners. Their demands were not vague or chaotic. They wanted an end to serfdom, fair taxation, and equal rights under the law. Radical voices like the priest John Ball, who preached that all men were born equal, added a revolutionary edge to the movement. These were not simple rioters. They were people with a vision of justice shaped by hardship. When the rebels entered London, they were met not with immediate resistance, but fear. Many officials fled, and the young king, Richard II, only 14 years old at the time, was forced into direct negotiation. Tyler presented his demands with bold confidence, and surprisingly, the king appeared to agree. But the situation quickly unraveled. During a second meeting at Smithfield, a dispute erupted between Tyler and the king's retinue. In the confusion, Tyler was struck down, and the rebellion lost its central figure. The king seized the moment, promising peace while rallying loyal forces to regain control. Without Tyler's leadership, the rebels were dispersed, many captured or punished in brutal reprisals. Though the revolt ultimately failed to force permanent change at the time, its impact ran deeper than the authorities realized. For the first time, commoners had confronted monarchy face to face and demanded a voice. The events of 1381 planted the seeds of transformation that would slowly reshape English society, reminding future generations that power, once challenged, is never quite the same again.
The German Peasants War of 1524 to 1525 was the most widespread popular uprising in Europe before the French Revolution, shaking the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire. What began as localized unrest over land rights and feudal dues spiraled into a continent-wide rebellion involving hundreds of thousands of farmers, craftsmen, and day laborers. The timing was no coincidence. Martin Luther's recent challenge to the Catholic Church had unleashed a surge of new thinking, and many peasants believed that if spiritual authority could be questioned, so too could the secular order. In southern Germany, a list of demands known as the 12 Articles quickly spread through the countryside. These outlined grievances that had long gone unheeded: unfair taxation, forced labor, and the monopolization of resources by the nobility. The rebellion wasn't just about hunger or hardship. It was about dignity and the right to live freely under God's law. Armed with farming tools and basic weapons, tens of thousands assembled in improvised armies, stormed castles, and took over towns. For a brief moment, it seemed the medieval hierarchy might crumble under the pressure. But the revolt lacked cohesion. Different groups had different goals, and leadership was fractured. Some factions sought peaceful negotiation, while others turned to force. The rebels often failed to coordinate, and their victories were scattered and temporary. Meanwhile, the nobility regrouped. In an unexpected twist, Martin Luther himself condemned the uprising, fearing chaos more than tyranny. His rejection of the revolt alienated many who had looked to him for moral support, weakening the peasants' sense of legitimacy. The turning point came when princely armies, better armed and well organized, launched a ruthless counteroffensive. They swept through rebel-held areas, overwhelming the disjointed peasant forces. Battles turned into massacres, and entire villages were left in ruins.
Historians estimate that over 100,000 people were lost in the crackdown. The movement collapsed almost as quickly as it had risen, its leaders executed or imprisoned. Though it ended in tragedy, the Peasants' War was not in vain. It revealed the fault lines of society in transition and forced both secular and religious leaders to reckon with the power of mass discontent. The demands of the rebels echoed in later movements, and the dream of a more just order remained alive beneath the surface of European history.
The Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 through 1638 unfolded in Japan's southern islands during a time when the Tokugawa shogunate sought to consolidate power and enforce strict social order. This revolt wasn't just about overtaxation, it was a fierce reaction to both economic suffering and religious suppression. In the Shimabara Peninsula and the nearby Amakusa Islands, peasants and former samurai had grown increasingly desperate. Crippling taxes imposed by local lords left families starving, while the persecution of Christianity, which had taken root in the region decades earlier, deepened the sense of injustice. The spark came when the lord of Shimabara, Matsukura Katsuyi, raised taxes even further to fund the construction of a new castle, ignoring the cries of his suffering subjects. Villagers who tried to petition for relief were met with brutal punishment. Eventually, thousands of farmers, fisherfolk, and disbanded warriors took up arms. Among them were many secret Christians, who saw the rebellion not only as a fight for survival, but as a spiritual cause. At the center of the movement emerged a mysterious teenage leader, Amakusa Shiro, who was believed by many to possess divine guidance. His presence gave the rebels a powerful symbol of hope. The rebels captured Hara Castle, a neglected fortress overlooking the sea, and fortified it as their base. Over the next several months, they withstood siege by government forces, repelling wave after wave of assaults. Their resistance astonished the shogunate, which eventually had to call in reinforcements from across the country. Despite their limited resources, the rebels held out through the winter, sustained by their unity and belief in their cause. However, supplies dwindled, and the walls began to fall. When the castle was finally breached, the rebellion ended in bloodshed. Authorities made an example of the survivors, ensuring that none would remain to spark another uprising. Christianity, already under suspicion, was now completely outlawed, and those who practiced it were forced even deeper underground. The Tokugawa government tightened control, launching a period of isolation that would last over 2 centuries. Though the Shimabara Rebellion was brutally suppressed, it left behind a legacy of defiance. The memory of Amakusa Shiro lived on in folklore and art, and the rebellion served as a warning to rulers that even the most rigid systems can be shaken when desperation meets belief. In silence, hidden communities continued their faith for generations, waiting for a day they could once again live it openly. The American Revolution, which began in 1775, started as a conflict over taxes and representation, but evolved into a full-blown struggle for independence that reshaped the world. Tensions had simmered for years between Britain and its North American colonies. Laws like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act symbolized not just economic burden, but a deeper insult, that decisions affecting colonial life were being made by a distant government with no colonial input. Protests grew louder, boycotts took hold, and pamphlets urging self-determination spread like wildfire. When British troops clashed with colonial militias at Lexington and Concord, it marked more than a violent outburst. It was the moment when political disagreement turned into organized resistance. The colonies, each with their own history and priorities, found themselves drawn into a shared cause. Leaders like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson emerged, giving the rebellion both a military front and a philosophical backbone. The Declaration of Independence, issued in 1776, crystallized that purpose. The colonies were not just resisting, they were claiming the right to govern themselves. Fighting continued across hills, rivers, and towns, with major turning points like the Battle of Saratoga bringing international attention. France's decision to support the revolutionaries shifted the balance, transforming a colonial revolt into a global war. British forces found themselves stretched thin, facing not only persistent militias, but growing discontent back home. Washington's army, though often outnumbered and undersupplied, held firm through harsh winters and strategic retreats, slowly wearing down British resolve. By 1781, after a siege at Yorktown and with French naval support,
British General Cornwallis surrendered, signaling the effective end of the conflict. 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as an independent nation. The revolution had succeeded, something few believed possible at its outset. But victory brought new questions. What kind of country would this be? How would it reconcile ideals of liberty with the reality of deep social divisions? While the American Revolution didn't answer all those questions, it lit a beacon. It showed that rebellion, when guided by a clear vision and unified purpose, could topple even the most established empire. And the effects rippled far beyond American shores, inspiring revolutions in France, Haiti, and beyond.
The Haitian Revolution, which erupted in 1791, remains one of the most astonishing and consequential uprisings in world history. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, then the richest in the world thanks to its brutal plantation system, enslaved Africans toiled under unbearable conditions to fuel European wealth. The ideals of liberty and equality voiced during the French Revolution reached these shores, but it was clear those promises did not extend to the enslaved. What began as a localized rebellion in the northern plantations soon transformed into a sweeping and organized movement that would reshape the global order. The early days were marked by chaos and fire as thousands rose up, destroying estates and challenging colonial authority. But out of that chaos emerged powerful leadership, most notably in Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved man who became a brilliant military and political strategist. He outmaneuvered French forces, rival rebel factions, and invading armies from Spain and Britain. Under his command, the rebel forces evolved into a disciplined army, securing control over much of the colony. He also began laying the groundwork for a self-governed, racially equal society, even restoring the economy through negotiated labor rather than coercion. However, peace would not last. Napoleon Bonaparte, seeking to restore French dominance, sent a massive expedition to crush the revolution and reinstate the old system. Louverture was captured through deceit and sent to Europe, where he passed away in captivity. But the revolution did not end with him. New leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines carried the fight forward with unrelenting determination. After years of warfare, the French troops, devastated by tropical disease and constant resistance, were finally forced to retreat. On January 1, 1804, Saint-Domingue declared its independence as Haiti, becoming the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. The birth of Haiti sent shockwaves around the world. It terrified slaveholders, inspired abolitionists, and challenged colonial powers who had assumed that such a rebellion could never truly succeed. The new nation faced immediate isolation, economic embargoes, and repeated threats. Yet its very existence was a radical statement of human resilience and justice. The Haitian Revolution shattered the notion that slavery was unbreakable. It showed the world that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be overturned when those at the bottom rose with unity, strategy, and a belief in their right to freedom. The Irish Rebellion of 1798 erupted with both hope and heartbreak, fueled by the vision of a united Ireland free from British control. At the center of the uprising was the Society of United Irishmen, a revolutionary group inspired by the ideals of the American and French revolutions. Their goal was bold: to overcome religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants and create a republic based on equality and independence. But in a country long divided and tightly controlled, turning vision into action would be anything but easy. Tensions in Ireland had been building for decades. British rule had entrenched a Protestant elite, while the vast majority, Catholics and dissenting Protestants alike, faced political exclusion and economic hardship. Reform efforts were crushed, and free speech was silenced. When Britain went to war with revolutionary France, Irish radicals saw an opportunity. They believed French forces might aid a rising in Ireland just as France had supported rebels in America.
Plans were drawn, weapons were smuggled, and secret oaths were taken. The rebellion began in May 1798, but coordination quickly unraveled. The British government, well aware of growing unrest, had already cracked down on rebel leaders and infiltrated many cells. Still, across counties like Wexford and Antrim, thousands rose in defiance. Farmers, laborers, and tradesmen took up arms, seizing towns and forming makeshift militias. For a brief moment, rebels controlled key regions and pitched battles were fought with determination and raw courage. The movement even formed its own provisional governments, hoping to prove that Irish self-rule was not just a dream. Yet, without sustained foreign support and facing an army that vastly outmatched them in training and resources, the rebellion began to falter. British forces responded with overwhelming force. Entire villages were burned, and public reprisals became a tool of terror. The French finally did arrive, but too late and in too small a number to turn the tide. The rebel cause, though passionately fought, could not overcome the full weight of British military might. By the end of the summer, the rising had been brutally suppressed. Its leaders, including the idealistic Wolfe Tone, were either captured or removed. Yet, despite its failure, the 1798 rebellion etched itself into Irish memory. It became a symbol of unity across religious lines and a milestone in the centuries-long struggle for Irish self-determination. The dream had not died, it had simply gone underground, waiting for another moment to rise again.
The Taiping Rebellion, which began in 1850, tore through China with such force that it ranks among the deadliest conflicts in human history. At its heart was a man named Hung Stu-Kwan, a failed civil service exam candidate who came to believe he was the younger brother of Jesus, chosen to rid China of corruption and establish a new heavenly kingdom. What started as a strange spiritual awakening became a full-scale revolution, one that would claim millions of lives and shake the Qing dynasty to its core. Hong's message blended Christian theology, personal revelation, and fierce social reform. He preached equality, the rejection of traditional Confucian hierarchy, and a society without foot-binding, arranged marriage, or private land ownership. His ideas resonated with China's suffering poor, especially in the South where economic hardship and ethnic tensions were widespread. His growing movement, known as the God Worshippers, gained followers by the tens of thousands. When Qing authorities tried to suppress them, open rebellion broke out. The rebels soon captured large territories and declared their own state, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with its capital in Nanjing. Hong ruled as its spiritual monarch, and the new regime sought to replace traditional Chinese culture with his religious doctrine. The rebellion transformed into a brutal civil war as Qing forces struggled to regain control. Local militias, foreign mercenaries, and imperial troops clashed in city after city. The countryside was devastated by fighting, famine, and forced displacement. For over a decade, the Taiping held vast swaths of southern China, implementing sweeping changes in areas under their control. Yet despite their success, internal divisions and rigid policies weakened their grip. Leadership disputes fractured the movement, and Hong, increasingly reclusive, withdrew from daily governance. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty, aided by Western powers who feared further instability, reorganized its forces. A new generation of commanders launched systematic campaigns to reclaim rebel territory. In 1864, imperial troops stormed Nanjing. The Taiping capital fell after weeks of siege, and what followed was a relentless purge. The rebellion collapsed in ruins, but the devastation left behind was staggering. Estimates vary, but tens of millions perished as a result of the conflict. Cities lay in ashes, and entire regions were depopulated. Though Hong's vision of a heavenly kingdom faded, the rebellion exposed the fragility of imperial rule and set the stage for future upheaval in a country struggling to modernize under mounting internal and external pressures.
The Indian Rebellion of 1857 began with a single spark inside a British military barracks. But within weeks, it became a sweeping uprising that challenged the very foundation of colonial rule. Known by many names, the Sepoy Mutiny, the First War of Independence, it erupted when Indian soldiers serving in the British East India Company's army refused to use rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, a violation of both Hindu and Muslim religious practices. Their refusal wasn't just about cartridges, it was a cry against decades of disrespect, exploitation, and cultural domination. Discontent had long been simmering. The East India Company had extended its reach into every aspect of Indian life, controlling land, laws, and trade. Local rulers were replaced, traditional customs were dismissed, and high taxes crushed farmers and artisans. The rebellion began in the northern city of Meerut, where mutinous soldiers turned their weapons on British officers and marched toward Delhi. There, they declared the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as the symbolic leader of a renewed Indian sovereignty. From Delhi, the uprising spread rapidly. Entire regions joined the revolt, soldiers, civilians, peasants, and deposed princes alike. Fierce battles broke out in Kanpur, Lucknow, and Jhansi. Women like Rani Lakshmi Bai emerged as fearless leaders, rallying their people in defense of independence. For over a year, the rebels controlled large swaths of the subcontinent, shaking British confidence and creating panic across the colonial establishment. But despite their determination, the rebels lacked unity. There was no central command, and goals varied widely across regions. Some fought for religious protection, others for local autonomy, and many simply to push out foreign rulers. The British, after initial shock, regrouped with brutal efficiency. Reinforcements arrived, loyalist troops were mobilized, and a campaign of suppression began. The siege of Delhi ended in heavy bloodshed, and the old Mughal dynasty was finally extinguished. By 1858, the rebellion had been crushed, but the aftermath was transformative. The British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India, marking the beginning of the British Raj. Policy shifted with more cautious reforms and a new strategy to manage the empire through alliances and divide-and-rule tactics. Though the rebellion failed to end colonial rule, it fundamentally changed the nature of imperial governance in South Asia. For many Indians, it became a symbol of resistance, remembered not for its end, but for its daring attempt to reclaim dignity in the face of domination.
The Boxer Rebellion, which reached its peak in 1900, was a fierce and desperate uprising born out of frustration with foreign interference, economic hardship, and cultural humiliation. In the final years of the Qing dynasty, China had become a patchwork of foreign-controlled spheres, where Western powers and Japan enjoyed special privileges, built railways, opened Christian missions, and imposed unequal treaties that stripped the country of autonomy. For many ordinary Chinese, this intrusion was not just political, it was personal. Their traditions, livelihoods, and dignity were being eroded before their eyes. In rural northern China, a secret society known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists began to gain followers. Called Boxers by Westerners because of their martial arts rituals, they saw themselves as defenders of Chinese values against outsiders and those who supported them. Their movement blended traditional beliefs, anti-imperial rage, and superstition. Many believed they were spiritually protected from bullets and foreign weapons. They blamed floods, famine, and suffering on the growing presence of Westerners and their Christian allies. At first, the Qing government hesitated to respond, but as the Boxers began targeting missionaries and Chinese converts, violence escalated. Soon, full-blown riots erupted across the countryside. Railway lines were destroyed, foreign compounds attacked, and cities thrown into chaos. In Beijing, the situation reached a breaking point when the Boxers laid siege to the foreign legation quarter, trapping diplomats, soldiers, and civilians inside for nearly 2 months. The Qing court, under Empress Dowager Cixi, ultimately sided with the Boxers, declaring war on the foreign powers, an act that would bring devastating consequences. An international coalition, including troops from Britain, Japan, Russia, the United States, and several other nations, launched a coordinated invasion. They fought their way through northern China, reaching Beijing in August 1900 and lifting the siege. In the aftermath, the foreign troops looted and punished communities across the region. Entire districts were ransacked, and the Qing court fled the capital.
China was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol the following year, agreeing to pay a massive indemnity, allow foreign troops to be stationed in the capital, and make formal apologies to foreign governments. The rebellion was crushed, but its impact was lasting. It exposed the fragility of the Qing dynasty and deepened China's crisis of identity. While the Boxers failed in their goals, their anger reflected a broader national despair, a sense that China had been backed into a corner by the world. In the years that followed, this humiliation helped fuel the revolutionary movements that would eventually end imperial rule entirely and set the country on a turbulent path toward modern nationhood.
The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 was not a battle for victory in the traditional sense. It was a stand for dignity, identity, and the refusal to disappear quietly. In the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, after years of systematic persecution, starvation, and forced labor, the remaining Jewish residents of the Warsaw Ghetto prepared for what they knew was likely their final confrontation. With deportations accelerating in the spring of 1943 and most of the ghetto already emptied, those who remained understood the fate that awaited them: transport to extermination camps. But instead of submitting, they chose resistance. Led by the Jewish Combat Organization, ZOB, and the Jewish Military Union, ZZW, the fighters were young, outnumbered, and desperately short on weapons. Pistols, homemade explosives, and smuggled rifles were all they had against a well-armed and highly trained occupying force. When German troops entered the ghetto to complete the deportations, they were met with gunfire and fierce resistance from buildings, cellars, and rooftop positions. The uprising had begun, not as a strategic campaign, but as an act of defiance, meant to disrupt, delay, and assert that Jewish lives would not be erased without resistance. The battle lasted far longer than the Germans had expected. Street by street, the rebels fought back, retreating into bunkers and tunnels as entire blocks were set ablaze. Smoke and flames filled the ghetto as the occupiers destroyed buildings to flush out the fighters. The uprising lasted for nearly a month, longer than many regular armies had resisted in the early stages of the war. Each day of survival became a message to the outside world and to history itself. They would not go quietly. Eventually, the uprising was overwhelmed. The ghetto was systematically leveled, and the remaining population either perished in the rubble or was captured and deported. But the psychological and symbolic weight of the uprising far outlived its physical defeat. News of the resistance spread through underground networks, becoming a rallying cry for others under Nazi occupation. In the aftermath of the war, the bravery of those who stood their ground in Warsaw came to represent a deeper truth about human resilience: that resistance is not always about winning, it's about refusing to surrender one's humanity. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remains one of the most moving and powerful examples of uprising against impossible odds. It closed a grim chapter in one of history's darkest periods with an act of profound courage that continues to inspire, teach, and remind us what it means to fight for one's right to exist.